Question 5, can men and women be equal? In this reading, we'll review the long struggle for women's rights throughout American history. We'll learn about a time in history we call second wave feminism. We'll explore the intellectual origins of this movement and try to understand how this movement for women's rights resulted in major changes in law, health, education, business, politics, and the military. Our big idea. The fight for women's rights is as old as the United States itself. At different periods, there has been more excitement and successes. In the 1960s and 70s, another wave of feminist zeal emerged. This third wave feminism correlated with changes in reproductive rights and social expectations, especially related to the workplace. Let's get started with our introduction. A shift towards more equality between men and women has been underway since the nation's founding. Sometimes progress has leapt forward, and sometimes seems to have come to a near standstill. The 1960s and 70s were one of these periods of rapid change for women. In the 1800s and early 1900s, the women's movement focused primarily on overturning legal obstacles to gender equality, such as voting rights and property rights. In contrast, the second wave feminism of the 1960s and 70s, inspired and galvanized by the civil rights movement of the same era, broadened the debate on women's rights to encompass a wider range of issues, including sexuality, family, the workplace, reproductive rights, and legal and traditional inequalities. We could look back over the shift towards more equality between men and women in American history and reasonably predict that the change will continue and that women and men will someday be treated equally in law, politics, work, sports, and society at large. But we must be careful not to assume that the past is destiny. What do you think? Can men and women be equal?
A long history of women's rights. In this question, we are focusing on the women's rights movement in the 1960s and 1970s, but there is a danger that this might give the impression that women were not interested in gaining equality before this time. In fact, women have been working to earn equal rights for America's entire history. When the Declaration of Independence was being drafted, for example, Abigail Adams, the wife of John Adams, the greatest agitator for independence, wrote and asked that the Founding Fathers remember the ladies. Alas, her request fell on deaf ears, and political and economic power remained firmly in the hands of men. In the early 1800s, women organized around religious, abolitionist, and temperance movements, and at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, formally launched the women's suffrage movement. When the Civil War ended in 1865, women thought they might be included in the 15th Amendment. To their dismay, supporters of suffrage for African Americans left women out, fearing that too few men would support the amendment if they were included. It was not until 1920, with the ratification of the 19th Amendment, that women finally won the right to vote. Women were not only concerned with voting. The cult of domesticity, the idea that women belonged at home with children while men worked, emerged along with the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s. The myth of the happy housewife persisted and was glorified in television sitcoms in the 1950s. But just as social reform movements made 19th century women more aware of their lack of power and encouraged them to form the first women's rights movement, the civil rights movements of the 1960s inspired many white and middle-class women to create their own organized movement for greater rights. Unlike the counterculture or the anti-war movements that were dominated by young people, many of the feminist activists were older, married women who found the traditional roles of mother and housewife unfulfilling. It was a group of women writers who ignited the movement. In 1963, Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique, in which she contested the post-World War II belief that it was women's destiny to marry and bear children. The perfect nuclear family image depicted and strongly marketed at the time, she wrote, did not reflect happiness and was rather degrading for women. Friedan's book was a bestseller and began to raise the consciousness of many women who agreed that homemaking in the suburbs sapped them of their individualism and left them unsatisfied. It was at this time that the word sexism entered the American vocabulary as women became categorized as a target group for discrimination. Single and married women adopted the title Ms. for both married and unmarried women as an alternative to Miss or Mrs. to avoid changing their identities based upon their relationships with men. In 1972, Gloria Steinem founded a feminist magazine of that name. Authors such as the feminist Germaine Greer impelled many women to confront social, political, and economic barriers. In 1960, women comprised less than 40% of the nation's undergraduate college classes, and far fewer women were candidates for advanced degrees. Despite voting for 4 decades, there were only 19 women serving in Congress in 1961. For every dollar that was earned by an American male, each working American female earned 59 cents. By raising a collective consciousness, these women writers helped launch a movement. Historians have since called this period of change second wave feminism. The Civil Rights Act of 1964. Feminist activists demanded equal pay for equal work and pressured the government to support and enforce legislation that prohibited gender discrimination. While the Equal Pay Act of 1964 had promised women that they would earn the same pay as men for the same work, the first major legislation that protected women in all of public life was the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act is usually remembered as the law that ended Jim Crow segregation in the South, but it also protects women from the same discrimination. Ironically, protection for women had been included at the suggestion of a conservative Virginia congressman in an attempt to prevent the act's passage. He believed that while white men might accept that African Americans needed and deserved protection from discrimination, the idea that women deserved equality with men would be far too radical for any of his male colleagues to contemplate. However, this strategy backfired and the measure was signed into law, granting protection to both ethnic minorities and women. In 1966, 2 years after the Civil Rights Act's passage, 28 women, including the author Betty Friedan, formed the National Organization for Women. Now, they wanted to preserve their newly won rights and now served as the de facto leader of the new feminist movement. Friedan, the organization's first president, proclaimed that NOW's goal would be to make possible women's participation in all aspects of American life and to gain for them all the rights enjoyed by men. Among the specific goals was the passage of an equal rights amendment to the Constitution that would guarantee the protections women had won in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Through the 1960s, 1970s, and beyond, NOW set the agenda for the women's movement by organizing protests, lobbying for legislative action, and fighting in court. Equal Rights Amendment. In 1963, a government commission released a detailed report describing discrimination against women in every aspect of American life and outlining plans to achieve equality. Specific recommendations for women in the workplace included fair hiring practices, paid maternity leave, and affordable child care. The Equal Pay Act that Congress passed a year later made progress on some of these fronts, but the law provided no way of enforcing equal pay for men and women performing equal work. In addition, it did not cover domestic workers, agricultural workers, executives, administrators, or professionals. What activists really wanted was an amendment to the Constitution that would guarantee gender equality. An Equal Rights Amendment, ERA, was not a new idea. In fact, Alice Paul, who had worked so hard to pass the 19th Amendment and win suffrage for women as leader of the National Women's Party, had first introduced it to Congress in 1923. Paul continued to work for the passage of the ERA until her death in 1977. Changing the Constitution is not easy, which is a good thing since it promotes stability in government and helps make sure bad ideas stay out. First, Congress must pass the amendment with a 2/3 majority in both the House and Senate. Then it must be ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures. Since such majorities in both Congress and of the states must approve an amendment, there is very little chance that a proposal supported by just one political party or region of the country would ever be ratified. NOW and the other women's rights organizations began a hard push for the ERA in 1970. Leaders such as Gloria Steinem, addressed Congress and provided argument after argument in support of the ERA. The House approved the measure in 1970, and the Senate did likewise in 1972. Supporters seemed to have momentum, and public opinion polls showed strong support. By 1973, 30 of the necessary 38 states ratified the amendment. Then the tide turned. A highly organized, determined opposition emerged that suggested that ratification of the ERA would lead to the complete unraveling of traditional American society. The leader of the Stop ERA campaign was a career woman named Phyllis Schlafly. Schlafly frustrated activists like Frieden, Steinem, and Paul by glorifying the traditional roles of American women. She heckled feminists by opening her speaking engagements with quips such as, "I'd like to thank my husband for letting me be here tonight." Schlafly argued that the ERA would bring undesirable changes to American women. In the end, the fight over the Equal Rights Amendment did not pit women against men. Instead, it pitted women against each other, fighting about how much they wanted the genders to be equal and how much they believed men and women were and should be different. Schlafly pointed out that protective laws like sexual assault and alimony would be swept away. The tendency of courts to award custody of children to mothers in divorce cases would be eliminated. The all-male military draft would become immediately unconstitutional. Those opposed to the ERA even suggested that single-sex restrooms might be banished by future courts. While many women were in favor of equality when they saw obvious ways in which men were favored in society, they were less inclined to support it when they thought about the way laws advantaged them. Stop ERA campaigned to prevent more state legislatures from ratifying the amendment. Advocates baked apple pies for the Illinois legislature while they debated the amendment. They hung "Don't Draft Me" signs on baby girls at protest marchers. The strategy worked. After 1973, the number of ratifying states slowed to a trickle. By 1982, only 35 states had voted in favor of the ERA, 3 states shy of the necessary total. Despite early gains by the feminist movement, Schlafly's campaign, and the general rise in social conservatism in the 1970s and 1980s led Americans of both genders to turn away from a constitutional guarantee of gender equality. Feminist groups continue to believe that the ERA campaign in the 1970s was a tragically lost opportunity to advance women's rights, and some still yearn to make it a reality. When Hillary Clinton ran for president in 2016, she championed a renewed push for passage of the ERA. The idea of amending the Constitution to guarantee gender equality is a century old, and perhaps someday the ERA will become law. But for now, while the 15th Amendment guarantees equality between the races, nowhere in the Constitution can a guarantee of equality for women be found. Radical feminism. Second-wave feminism was initiated by thoughtful writers and propelled forward by activists who focused on basic economic inequality and legal rights. More radical feminists, like their colleagues in other movements, were dissatisfied with merely redressing these issues and devised their own brand of consciousness-raising events and symbolic attacks on oppression. The most famous of these was an event staged in September 1968 by New York radical women. Protesting stereotypical notions of femininity and rejecting traditional gender expectations, the group demonstrated at the Miss America pageant in Atlantic City, New Jersey, to bring attention to society's exploitation of women, which they believed was on display at the pageant. The protesters crowned a sheep Miss America and then tossed instruments of what they believed was women's oppression, including high-heeled shoes, curlers, girdles, and bras, into a freedom trash can. News accounts famously and incorrectly described the protest as a bra burning. In fact, no one burned any bras. Despite the flashy nature of such protests, real change for women came through hard-won legislation and legal battles. Birth control. For thousands of years, the impact of sex had been different for men and women. For women, sex could result in pregnancy and motherhood. This biological fact was part of what defined the roles of men and women in American society. There were times when women were allowed to work outside the home, but the possibility of motherhood presented restrictions. For example, in the early 1900s, women could serve as school teachers, but they would lose their jobs if they were married. Society believed that a married woman belonged at home taking care of her husband and children. In the early 1900s, one woman believed the status quo needed to change. Margaret Sanger was a pioneer in the struggle for a woman's right to birth control. She famously said that no woman can call herself free who does not own and control her body. No woman can call herself free until she can choose consciously whether she will or will not be a mother. In an era when it was illegal to discuss the topic, she was arrested or charged with lawlessness many times for both her publications and her New York City clinics. Additionally, organized religions such as the Roman Catholic Church stood firm on their principles that artificial contraceptives were sinful. Despite Sanger's effort and the fact that women won the right to vote in 1919, birth control in any form remained illegal in most states, even for married couples. In the 1950s, philanthropist Catherine McCormick provided the funding for biologists to develop a birth control pill, a drug that women could take that would prevent pregnancy. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration approved the birth control pill for general use in 1960. For the first time, women could control the possibility of pregnancy on their own without relying on their partners. Within 5 years of the pill's approval, some 6 million women were using it. Despite the pill's obvious popularity, as a form of contraception, it remained illegal in many states. In a landmark decision, Griswold versus Connecticut in 1965, the Supreme Court ruled such laws unconstitutional. Setting a precedent, the court determined that a fundamental right to privacy exists between the lines of the Constitution. Laws prohibiting contraceptive choice violated this sacred right. The ban of prohibitive laws was extended to unmarried couples in Eisenstadt versus Baird in 1972, and a federal judge imparted the right to purchase contraceptives to unmarried minors in 1974. Equality, many feminists of the 1960s and 1970s believed, extended beyond the workplace, but to the bedroom as well, and women's rights movements heralded the availability of birth control as a method of granting women liberation. After all, if women were going to have the same rights as men in the workplace, they should be able to enjoy sex without fear of pregnancy just as much as men. The new contraceptive technology had a major impact on American life. Being able to avoid pregnancy meant that women could be sexually active and remain unmarried. In earlier times, sex usually led to pregnancy and then quickly to marriage. Birth control, therefore, indirectly prolonging the age at which many women first married. This allowed women to invest in education and become more career-oriented. And after the pill was legalized, there was a sharp increase in college attendance and graduation rates for women. Birth control in general, and the pill in particular, were seen as excellent, inexpensive ways to combat poverty. Women could finish school, earn college degrees, and work before having children. A new mother at age 26 with a degree and a few years of savings already put away is in much better position financially than a new mother at age 19 who has only finished high school. As a result, the pill was endorsed by many government officials, including President Johnson, and was distributed by doctors who could see the benefits it had for their patients. The pill was not entirely without its detractors. In fact, it became a controversial subject as Americans struggled with their thoughts on sexual morality, controlling population growth, and women's control of their reproductive rights. Never before had sexual activity been so separated from reproduction. For a heterosexual couple using the pill, intercourse became purely an expression of love, a means of physical pleasure, or both. While this was true of previous contraceptives, their relatively high failure rates and their less widespread use failed to have the social impact of the pill. The spread of oral contraceptive use led many religious figures and institutions to debate the proper role of sex in society. The Roman Catholic Church in particular reiterated its teaching that artificial contraception distorts nature and the purpose of sex. Opponents of the pill and the sexual freedom it provided to women cited the increase in children born to unmarried mothers, sexually transmitted diseases, teen pregnancy, and divorce rates as evidence that the decline in traditional gender roles, brought about in part by the availability of birth control, was bad for America. Despite opposition, the use of the oral contraceptive pill continues to be widespread. As of 2010, 80% of sexually active women had used the pill at some point in their lives. Today, women have other options for birth control that do not involve their partners, including implants and patches, but the pill remains the most popular, and its effect on society is undeniable. Abortion. No topic related to the feminist movement has aroused such passion and controversy as much as the right to an abortion, a medical procedure that ends a pregnancy. In the 1960s, there was no federal law regulating abortions, and many states had banned the practice entirely, except when the life of the mother was endangered. Women's groups argued that illegality led many women to seek black market abortions by unlicensed physicians or to perform the procedure on themselves. As a result, several states such as California and New York began to legalize abortions. With no definitive ruling from the federal government, women's groups sought the opinion of the Supreme Court. The battle began in Texas, which outlawed any type of abortion unless a doctor determined that the mother's life was in danger. A woman challenged the law banning abortion. As the case slowly made its way up from the lower courts to the Supreme Court, she was referred to in court documents only as Jane Roe in order to protect her privacy. Defending the law was the Dallas District Attorney, Henry Wade. Thus, the case became known as Roe versus Wade. In 1973, the Supreme Court invalidated the Texas law by a 7-2 vote. The majority of the justices maintained that although the Constitution never mentions abortion, a woman's right to abortion is implied by the Constitution's guarantee of privacy. Because of the Roe v. Wade decision, no state could restrict abortions during the first 3 months or trimester of a pregnancy. States were permitted to adopt restrictive laws in accordance with respecting the mother's health during the second trimester. The practice could be banned outright during the third trimester. Any state law that conflicted with this ruling was automatically overturned. Women's rights groups were ecstatic, but immediately an opposition emerged. The Roman Catholic Church had long criticized abortion as a form of infanticide, and many fundamentalist Protestant ministers joined the outcry. The National Right to Life Committee formed with the explicit goal of reversing Roe versus Wade. The question of abortion is fundamentally thorny because it involves basic beliefs about life, and often those beliefs are based on religion. Those who believe life begins at conception feel that the unborn child deserves the same legal protections as an adult. Ending such a life is equivalent to murder to those who subscribe to this belief. They believe that the government has a responsibility to protect all people, including those who have not yet been born. Opponents of abortion use the label pro-life to define their cause. Others argue that life begins at birth and that laws restricting abortion interfere with the right of a woman to decide what is in her own best interest. They believe that the government has no business telling women what to do with their bodies. Some argue that opponents of abortion are trying to impose their religious beliefs on others. Supporters of Roe v. Wade identify themselves as pro-choice. Since 1973, the battle has raged. Pro-life groups began to lobby their senators and representatives to propose a right-to-life amendment to the Constitution. Although introduced in Congress, the measure has never received the necessary support. Pro-choice groups such as the National Abortion Rights Action League fear that a slow erosion of abortion rights has taken place since Roe v. Wade, as states pass laws that make it harder to gain access to an abortion. The Hyde Amendment of 1976 prohibits the use of federal Medicaid funds for abortions. The idea behind the law was that because Medicaid is funded by taxes, people who believe abortion is wrong should not be forced to pay for it, even in a roundabout way. Since the Supreme Court ruled that women have a fundamental right to abortion, that right has been limited by a long string of laws and court cases. For example, in the 1992 case, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, the Supreme Court ruled that states have the right to impose waiting periods and parental notification requirements so girls under the age of 18 cannot have an abortion without their parents' knowledge. In 2014, the Texas legislature passed a law that set new guidelines for operating abortion clinics. The law was so strict that half of all clinics could not meet the new standards, closed. In some areas, abortion was legal, but women had to travel hundreds of miles to find a doctor willing and able to carry out the procedure. The Supreme Court ruled the law unconstitutional in Whole Woman's Health versus Hellerstedt in 2016. The court upheld this ruling in 2019 when it blocked implementation of a similar law in Louisiana. However, it will take many years to open new clinics to replace those that had to close. Pro-life advocates may have lost in court, but won in practical terms. Planned Parenthood is an organization that provides women with health care and advice about contraception, cancer screening, and many other issues. However, since they pride themselves on providing safe, inexpensive abortions, protesters regularly picket outside their offices. Several Planned Parenthood sites have even been bombed, and doctors who perform abortions murdered by anti-abortion extremists. While the fight goes on in state capitals and in protest marches, the real fate of Roe v. Wade continues to lie with the Supreme Court. Although every ruling since 1973 upheld the fundamental decision that women have a right to abortion, the composition of the court changes with every retirement. Activists on each side demand a litmus test for any judge named to the federal courts. Republicans have tended to appoint pro-life judges, and Democrats have selected pro-choice nominees. If Republican presidents were someday able to appoint enough conservative justices to significantly alter the balance of the court, opponents of Roe v. Wade might have a chance of succeeding. For now, the battle remains as fierce as ever. Divorce. For most of America's history, it was difficult for couples to divorce. Marriage was an institution that was dominated by organized religions, and they were loath to grant divorces. Even well into the 1900s, divorces were granted only in cases of abuse or infidelity. Many Americans believed this was good for society. However, in the 1970s, things began to change. In 1967, California passed the nation's first no-fault divorce law. With this change, couples could divorce for any reason, or no reason at all. Within a few years, many other states followed California's lead and passed no-fault divorce laws of their own. The impact was dramatic. In the 1960s, there were 9.2 divorces per 1,000 married women. Just 20 years later, in 1980, that number had more than doubled to 22.6 divorces per 1,000 married women. Less than 20% of marriages in 1950 ended in divorce, but roughly 50% of all couples who married in 1970 eventually divorced. Before the advent of no-fault divorce, social pressure and the authority of religious leaders convinced many couples to stay together, even when relationships had frayed. Sometimes it was challenging to prove that a spouse had been unfaithful, and people were trapped in broken marriages. A change in the law gave legitimacy to divorce and began to erode the moral authority of churches. Eventually, many churches bent to the times. For example, the United Methodist Church, the largest mainline Protestant denomination in America, announced in 1976 that they would be accommodating of divorced and remarried congregants. As the rate of divorce grew, Americans began to worry about the effect divorce was having on children. On one hand, single parents usually have less time to spend with their children because they are working and are often more stressed since they have to bear the entire responsibility of raising children. On the other hand, it is perhaps equally stressful for children to be raised in homes filled with conflict. In the long term, as marriage has lost its importance in the midst of young people, more and more have chosen to live together without being married. Now, about 40% of all American children will live in a home with unmarried parents. Since these relationships are less stable, the vast majority of children born to unmarried couples see their parents separate by the time they turn 15. Since the 1980s, divorce rates have come down somewhat, but they are still far higher than they were below no-fault divorce laws were enacted. Another major change that happened to divorce laws in the 1970s related to the disposition of property. In many states, head and master laws gave husbands final say over all property. Men could make financial decisions without consulting their wives. This meant that in cases of divorce, husbands could take property and savings and leave their ex-wives with nothing. In 1981, the Supreme Court ruled such laws unconstitutional in the case Kirschberg versus Feenstra. Citing the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection under law, they ruled that head of mastery laws unfairly favored men over women. Although the rise in divorce rates since the passage of no-fault laws in the 1970s has resulted in social problems that were rare beforehand, the ability of women to obtain a divorce and protection of property has allowed women to escape abusive and unhappy marriages. Title IX. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a major step forward in protecting women from discrimination, but it was written to protect women from discrimination in public places such as stores and bus stations. Many activists wanted a law specifically designed to protect the rights of female students, and so Title IX was enacted as a follow-up to the Civil Rights Act. While Title IX is best known for its impact on high school and collegiate athletics, the original statute made no explicit mention of sports. However, coverage of sports was implied. The impact of the law on female athletes has been enormous. One study completed in 2006 pointed to a large increase in the number of women participating in athletics at both the high school and college level. For every one girl involved in high school sports before Title IX was enacted, there are 9 now, and the number of women in college sports has increased by more than 450%. A 2008 study of intercollegiate athletics showed that women's collegiate sports has grown to 9,101 teams, or 8.65 per school. Some critics of the law contend that Title IX has resulted in the dismantling of men's sports programs. For example, though interest in the sport of wrestling has consistently increased at the high school level since 1990, scores of colleges have dropped their wrestling programs during that same period. In order to offer equal opportunities, some schools have chosen to reduce the options for men rather than increase them for women. Men's sports such as golf, tennis, rowing, track, swimming, as well as wrestling have all been abandoned by schools trying to comply with Title IX. Most of these sports are money losers for colleges. That is, the cost of equipment and coaches exceeds what the sports earn in ticket sales. Athletic directors are forced to make hard choices when money is short, and although many would love to offer every sport for both male and female students, the law's requirements make cutting legacy men's programs a necessity. Critics of Title IX believe this is unfair. There are currently 1.3 million more boys participating in high school sports than girls. Since colleges are forced to offer equal opportunities, some of those boys will simply have no teams to play for. Despite such arguments, women's athletic programs are still far from equal to men's programs. The Women's Sports Foundation reported in a 2007 study of NCAA institutions that men's athletics received the lion's share of athletic department budgets for operating expenses, recruiting, scholarships, and coaches' salaries. Title IX applies to all educational programs and all aspects of a school, not only to athletics. One of the important other areas the law has affected is the way schools have dealt with sexual harassment against female students. The Supreme Court ruled that when school administrators fail to protect students from harassment, they are denying girls equal access to education. As a result, the law has been used multiple times to force school leaders to address claims of sexual abuse and harassment and to institute programs to protect female students. In 2006, for example, a federal court found that there was sufficient evidence that the University of Colorado acted with deliberate indifference towards students Lisa Simpson and Ann Gilmore, who were sexually assaulted by student football players. The university settled the case, promising to change its policies and paid $2.5 million in damages. In 2008, Arizona State University was the subject of a lawsuit that alleged violations of rights guaranteed by Title IX. In that case, the university expelled a football player for multiple instances of severe sexual harassment, but readmitted him, and he went on to rape a student in her dorm room. Despite its claim that it bore no responsibility, the school settled the lawsuit, agreeing to revise and improve its official response to sexual misconduct and to pay the plaintiff $850,000 in damages and fees. Between 2010 and 2016, the Department of Education under President Obama announced that transgender students are also protected from discrimination under Title IX. It instructed public schools to treat transgender students consistent with their gender identity in academic life. A student who identifies as a transgender boy, for instance, is allowed entry to a boys-only class, and a student who identifies as a transgender girl is allowed entry to a girls-only class. This change in policy is currently in flux. In February 2017, the Departments of Justice and Education under the Trump administration withdrew the guidance on gender identity issued by the Obama administration, and in 2018, the Department of Education announced that Title IX did not allow transgender students to use the bathroom of their gender identities. This is an issue that seems likely to be destined for the Supreme Court sometime in the coming years. The glass ceiling. In 1978, American writer Marilyn Loden described an invisible barrier that limited the ability of women to rise in organizations to higher positions of power. This was nothing new. Women were keenly aware that men dominated leadership positions in politics, business, education, and the military. In her speech, Loden coined the term the glass ceiling to describe this reality. Despite major changes over the past few decades, the glass ceiling has persisted. As of 2014, only 5% of major companies were led by female CEOs. This trend persists in lower ranks as well. Far more men serve as directors and managers in American companies. In general, in the workforce, women are at a disadvantage. In 2018, women earned 78 cents for every dollar earned by men. In identical jobs, women earn 98 cents for every dollar earned by men. Part of the reason for this is the penalty people pay for gaps in work. For both men and women, not working for periods of time, even for a few months, usually means starting again at a lower pay scale. However, since women are much more likely to have gaps in their working life to take care of children or aging parents, they disproportionately pay this penalty. In politics, women are still underrepresented as well. Although Hillary Clinton won the Democratic primary in 2016 and became the first woman to head a major party ticket, she lost to Donald Trump in the general election. Unlike many of the world's other advanced nations, the United States has never had a female president. In Congress in 2018, 23% of senators are women, and in the House of Representatives, only 19% are women. On the Supreme Court, there are currently 3 women out of 9. For 192 years, a Supreme Court that was made up exclusively of men made the most important judicial decisions in America. Finally, in 1981, Sandra Day O'Connor was appointed by President Reagan. Since then, 3 other women have served on the court. Women in the armed forces. The role that women have played in the armed forces has changed over America's history, most rapidly in the past few decades. For most of America's history, combat was a role reserved for men. There were a few notable exceptions. The first female American soldier was Deborah Sampson of Massachusetts, who enlisted in the Continental Army under the name of Robert Shurtleff. She served for 3 years in the Revolutionary War and was wounded twice, and cut a musket ball out of her own thigh so no doctor would find out she was a woman. In another case of hidden identity, Sarah Rosetta Wakeman enlisted under the alias Lyons Wakeman in the Civil War. These women, brave as they might have been, did not significantly change the role women played in the armed forces. Generally, women served as cooks, cleaners, and nurses who followed the armies but did not see combat. Perhaps the first time that a woman openly advocated for the chance to go into combat was in 1898 at the cusp of the Spanish-American War. Annie Oakley, the hero of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, wrote a letter to President McKinley in which she offered the government the services of a company of 50 lady sharpshooters who would provide their own arms and ammunition should war break out with Spain. The Spanish-American War did occur, but Oakley's offer was not accepted. Women began taking on roles traditionally held by men for the first time during World War I. The first American women enlisted into the regular armed forces were 13,000 women admitted into active duty in the Navy and Marines, and a much smaller number admitted into the Coast Guard. The yeoman recruits and women Marines primarily served in clerical positions, but they received the same benefits as men, including identical pay, and were considered veterans after the war. In 1941, women again found that opportunities were opening up that had been closed before. There were 350,000 American women who served during World War II in the Army and Navy, as well as countless women who served in civilian capacities, replacing men who were in uniform. During the war, women served in separate female-only units, but in 1948, President Truman signed the Women's Armed Forces Services Act, allowing women to serve in the armed forces in fully integrated units during peacetime. Women again served in Korea and Vietnam, but as before, they were only allowed to play supporting roles. Women were nurses, clerks, telephone operators, and sometimes transport pilots, but were never assigned to jobs in which combat was an expectation, and they had few opportunities to advance into the upper ranks. That began to change in the 1970s. In 1976, the United States Air Force Academy, United States Coast Guard Academy, United States Military Academy at West Point, and the United States Naval Academy became coeducational, and women were able to join the same pathways as their male peers toward becoming officers. In 1996, women won admission to the Virginia Military Institute when the Supreme Court declared in United States versus Virginia that the school could not discriminate against women if it wanted to maintain its status as a premier military academy with direct connections to the Army. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote in the court's opinion that VMI could not deny to women, simply because they are women, full citizenship stature, equal opportunity to aspire, achieve, participate in, and contribute to society. Prohibitions against women in combat also began to crumble. The 1991 Persian Gulf War proved to be the pivotal time for the role of women in the armed forces. Over 40,000 women served in almost every role the armed forces had to offer. However, while many came under fire, they were not permitted to participate in deliberate ground engagements. Despite this, there are many reports of women engaging enemy forces during the conflict. During the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War of the 2000s, more than 200,000 women served, of which 152 lost their lives. Finally, women had the opportunity to demonstrate their patriotism, valor, and abilities, and in 2008, Anne Dunwoody became the first female four-star general in the Army. In 2012, Janet Wolfenbarger became the first female four-star general in the Air Force, and Michelle Howard began her assignment as the Navy's first female and first African-American female four-star admiral in 2014. In December 2015, Defense Secretary Ash Carter stated that beginning in 2016, all combat jobs would open to women. Thus, 241 years after the outbreak of the American Revolution, women had finally gained full access to the armed forces. It's hard to make the argument that New Wave feminism was responsible for changing the role of women in the military service, since this was an evolution rather than a revolution. Additionally, full inclusion did not occur until decades after the protests of the 1960s and 1970s, so it's a stretch to claim some direct cause and effect relationship between New Wave feminism and gender parity in the armed forces. However, it is significant to note that the 1970s marked the turning point in which women began to take on combat and leadership positions. It might not have been the work of the feminist activists themselves that caused this change, but evidence does show that changing attitudes in society were reflected in military policy.
Conclusion. New Wave feminism radically changed the face of American culture, leading to major shifts in public acceptance of birth control, the availability of abortion, divorce law, and widespread integration of women into sports activities, the military, and the workplace. The advocates of women's rights in the 1970s did not gain all that they had hoped for. They tried and failed to add the Equal Rights Amendment to the United States Constitution. But, like the many feminists who worked in the centuries before them and persisted in the face of disappointments, they have pressed on. Due to their continued efforts, it is no longer inconceivable that a woman might lead a major corporation, play professional sports, or be elected president. Since the history of inequality between genders in America is long and continues to evolve, the end of this chapter remains unwritten. What do you think? Can men and women ever be equal?
Small brother, everybody get together.